today's deliberations on liberalism in crises between totalitarian responses and progressive dreams. I don't know what you did early this morning. I had the misfortune of looking at the television, which showed me Modi and Trump hand in hand. Both of them not only posing in front of the Taj Mahal, no, he posed with his wife in front of the Taj Mahal, Trump, but the two of them sitting on Gandhi's really austere little house, and even pretending to spin some cloth. So this really made my day today. And I thought it's not only just liberalism in crises, but with the two of them thumping each other's backs, saying how wonderful both countries are thriving institutionally, economically, politically, and now also in terms of defense. I think it's democracy in serious crises as well. It's not just liberalism, because I think what we understand by democracy will need to be rethought after this kind of majoritarian comrades in arms. But that said, because I had a bad start to the day, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Jacques Rupnik.
It can only get better now.
It can who is actually, he needs no introduction either to most of you or to the house. Jacques is such an old friend of the house that actually I think most of you know him probably longer than I do. For those of you who don't, just maybe a few words of welcome and a word of warm thanks for being with us and giving the keynote this morning. Jacques Rupnik is Director of Research at the Centre d'études et de recherche internationale, CERI, at Sciences Po in Paris. And as all of you know, he's a leading expert on politics in Central East and Southeastern Europe. His research covers a very wide range of topics. We've heard him give talks at the IWM before. It deals with nationalism, with questions of identity politics, democracy, also European integration, the politics of political participation. He's currently working on issues of democratic transitions and the rise of populism in Eastern and Central Europe, and on nationalism, focusing both on the demise of federal states and the building of nation states in the Balkans. What is impressive about his career is not just numerous, very, very important books and edited volumes, but also the fact that the world of academia and scholarship has actually, I think, been too narrow for you. You began your career with the BBC reporting on Eastern Europe. You continued to be a political analyst and an expert, reaching broad audiences with a lot of policy advice. So you've not only advocated but practiced the art of making scholarly expertise available for sound policy making. Fortunately, you've not been tempted to become a politician yourself. A temptation which I think many in your generation have had in this part of the world. And instead, you have served as advisor to the President of the Czech Republic, to Václav Havel, from 1990 to 92, Executive Director of the International Commission for the Balkans, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, advisor to the European Commission, 2007 to 2010. So with your very strong commitment to democracy and peace building, of course, you've had a long history with the Institute. You've been here several times as our guest, as a speaker. You've been a very regular contributor to our journal, Transit. I think you were associated with its very first issue as well. And you were associated with the very first book which we brought out with Passagen Verlag on when democracies are dismantled democratically. Also contains an essay of yours with caution and warnings about the dismantling of democracy in this part of the world. Let me just mention your latest book, which is Europe at the Crossroads, came out a couple of years ago. Democracy, Neighborhoods, and Migrations. So with that, a very warm welcome, and we look forward to listening to you.
Well, pleasure to be here and be among friends, because, as you said, my association with EVM has been a long one, and although there is fortunately a renewal of fellows and associates, it's good to see, to recognize few old friends, and therefore that is why I do not intend to give a long lecture. I want this to be meant as an introduction to the discussion that will be here, it's just the contrast, since you mentioned that I have been working on democratic transitions. Well, now it's more working on transitions in reverse, transition from democracy. So that's just the context in which we are talking about this. It's interesting that this whole wave of writing about democracy and the spread of democracy after 1989 is now contrasted with the whole academic industry of books about populism, authoritarianism, illiberalism, etc., etc. So as if this was to be a long-term question, long-term trend. And this is perhaps something we may discuss. Is this a temporary sort of illness from which we're likely to recover in due course, or is this a more lasting trend? What you just mentioned about this morning news suggests that we are not talking just about the pathology of few laggards in Eastern or Central Europe, but this is a much more general problem. So we have here already a double question. One is about the longue durée. You know, is this a long-term cycle or trend, or is this and is it specific to this region, or is it a global? So this is already a couple of things. Pierre Rosanvallon has just published a book, Le siècle du populisme, so a populist century. Well, I mean, I hope it's not the whole century, but clearly it indicates that this is here to stay, and that it is. And the reason why he's talking like that, because he's not particularly focusing on East Central Europe. He's focusing on the state of democracy in a broader context. So that is the context in which we are talking about it. When you, of course, here we are interested in, Orban, Kaczynski, etc., etc. But then you add, as you just said, Trump, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro. I mean, the list is getting longer and longer. And that is the context in which we are talking about it. What is relevant for us, I will perhaps return to that in the conclusion, is that it might have started in this region, but now that the two main liberal democracies, the US and Britain, with Brexit and with Trump, have become part of the problem, we can no longer simply dispense with the particularities of the post-communist syndrome or post-communist legacies, etc. Though I'm not saying this is not a factor, but certainly I'm saying all this just to make clear that although I'll be talking about Central Europe mainly, I have the broader picture in mind. I had prepared things about definitions of populism and illiberalism. I fear that in this audience, perhaps this is not a necessary endeavor. I would simply perhaps say something that what is important, at least if we're talking about the realignment of politics today, is the shift from the traditional divides that have dominated the 20th century, the ideological divides, the partisan divides, as we have known them between right and left, and pictures that have national varieties, but that were familiar to all of us, with a horizontal divide, elites versus people, and a vertical divide, which is openness and closure. And those are the divides that have now become key to understanding the political cleavages. And what we are witnessing with what the French call dégagisme, that is, you oust any government that is in place because they are part of the same elite and they're all the same and they're interchangeable. In fact, the leader of the French left populist party, Mélenchon, had published a book, Qu'ils s'en aillent tous, let them all go away, do away with them, with the whole lot. So that's the common trend. Get out of the way. But this double axis, elite people, openness versus closure, that has implications for, of course, the separation of powers, the institutions of representative democracy, and more general for the whole attitude towards what the French call les corps intermédiaires, the intermediate body, the whole idea of mediation in politics. And the second, the openness versus closure, that raises the question, of course, who then belongs to the people. And the populists give a nativist definition of the nation, and there you have a debate about, that there you have the big issue of contemporary politics about the definition of the who belongs to the political community. And as soon as you're talking about the nation, of course, then you bring in the emotional dimension of politics, albeit the politics of fear, and there we have an interesting reversal. Albert Hirschman's book, Passions and Interests, suggested that the post-war development where we were moving from political passions towards a politics dominated by interest. Well, we may be going the other way around. People now sometimes vote against their interest and moved by strong passions. The third sort of preliminary question is about the relation of what is called illiberal populism and authoritarianism. Sometimes they're simply lumped together or used interchangeably. And I've had a small argument with Jan Werner Müller about this. He, as you know, says, don't talk about illiberal democracy. Either you're liberal democracy, and that's true democracy, or you are an authoritarian. Well, that has the advantage of simplifying the question. I believe it dodges an important issue behind the whole phenomenon we are trying to understand. And yes, it is true that the populist narrative, and more generally the populist approach to politics is a threat to pluralism, is a threat to independent institutions. But, as I say, the issue is a much older one. If democracy as popular sovereignty has a whole history, which I will not inflict on you now, but at least we should be aware. I mean, again, in the French context, you have the liberals, Benjamin Constant, and you have this tradition all the way to Isaiah Berlin and his distinction between positive and negative freedom, and you have the idea that this is a democracy of enjoyment of freedom. So what the system is here for is to maximize the enjoyment of your individual freedom, and engagement in politics, in public life, is an option. I mean, politics is here for people who get bored at home, basically. That's more or less their take on it. And then you have the other strand, which was often associated with the French Revolution, with Rousseau, etc., which is la volonté générale, the idea that there is participation of the people, participation as a key element in democratic life, and these two strands have often been in tension. And today they are even in some respects opposed. So you have this issue, which combines with another dimension. My late friend and colleague Pierre Asner, who is greatly missed. I mean, his take on this was that liberal democracy is being squeezed from two sides. From the populist side, the volonté générale, those who want united, transparent, innocent people versus the elite. And from the other side, the liberal technocracy. And these are the two sides, and we tend to focus now on the first one for very good reasons, but the second one is to be considered as well, because they are mutually reinforcing. The two threats that Pierre Asner mentioned are mutually reinforcing. Let me give you just one quotation that I brought just to illustrate what I'm talking about, and it's not from Orban or somebody like that. No, it's from somebody who was in Tony Blair's government, who was a minister for constitutional affairs. You cannot be closer to liberal democracy than that, Lord Falconer. And this is what this is taken from his speech. And I'll read it because I think it is worth bearing that in mind before we launch onto the other, the main issue, the illiberal populism. So, Lord Falconer, what governs our approach is a clear desire to place power where it should be, increasingly not with a politician, but with those best fitted in different ways to deploy it. Interest rates are not set by politicians in the Treasury, but by the Bank of England. Minimum wages are not determined by the Department of Trade and Industry, but by the Law Pay Commission. Membership of the House of Lords will be determined not by Downing Street, but by an independent appointment commission. This is a crucial sentence. This depoliticizing of key decision-making is a vital element in bringing power closer to the people. I think this is, you cannot be more explicit than that. And this is the flip side of the coin, if you want. Yeah, the populist will, we don't want any constraints. And then you have this version, depoliticizing of key decision making. And this is supposed to bring power closer to the people. This is the general context, the two sides from which liberal democracy is being undermined. Final introductory comment is about populist and authoritarians, illiberal populism. As I said, the two terms are being used interchangeably, and we even had a dinner last night. Is he here? No, perhaps not. Your friend who was saying, "Oh, I don't want to talk about illiberal populists, etc." No, for me, authoritarians that's enough. I still believe it remains pertinent to keep the distinction between illiberal populist and authoritarianism, though there is a clear relationship between the two, and The main reason is that the populists engage or have to engage in electoral contests, in conditions that are more open, while authoritarians have mostly done away with the kind of constraints electoral politics imply. So to be sure, the lines are getting blurred. There is a continuum between illiberal populists and authoritarians, and hence the concept we use to describe these regimes reflect that ambivalence: democratura, competitive authoritarianism, etc., etc. There's a long list of stuff, ambivalent terms that try to capture the both elements. But I do believe that there is a continuum, if you want, from the illiberal populists, let's say of the Kaczynski type, to Putin, Erdogan, and other in that group, and that is actually worth studying or discussing. The slide from the evolution from one to the other, or the evolution from Orban Mark I. I don't mean the liberal Orban of 1990, I mean Orban Mark I 2000 to Orban Mark II. The slide is there. Or the slide from Chavez to Maduro in a different context. Yeah, you can have populists drift towards authoritarianism, that is clear, but it's still, for my money, it's still worth remembering that the two should be distinguished and separated. I then had perhaps that should be a final. We have launched into this because of recent developments in East Central Europe and now in Western liberal democracy. The term populism or anti-liberal strands has a long history in East Central Europe, and not necessarily with negative connotations. People think populism has become no. You read Venturi's book about Russian populism in the 19th century. It's part of evolution of Russian society and Russian democratic thinking. François Feiter, who was the person who initiated me to the study of East Central Europe in Paris. The last Habsburg, I used to call him, because he was born in the Austrian Empire still. And but I think it was his last text, contributed to a small colloquium on populism I was doing in Paris, contributed a text where he shows that the populist, in the Hungarian context, the populist movement was originally part of this democratic process. This was the entry of the masses into democratic politics. And you have those urbanists who thought the bourgeoisie and the working class these were the urbanists. This was supposed to be looking to the Western models of capitalism or social democracy or what have you. And then you had the populists who thought, no, it is the peasantry that is the bulk of our society, and therefore the age of democracy, the entry of the age of democracy means the entry of peasantry, and that requires a specific attention to that idea. And their emphasis was more on the rural, on the communal, on the national, etc., but not meant as an anti-democratic. It was not liberal, that's for sure, but it was not anti-democratic. He considered this as part of democracy. It's only in the late Horthy era and during the war that some of them became very nasty proto-fascist, or after the war, some of them have became fellow travelers of communism. The writer Gyula Ilyich and others. So again, just to show the problems has a history, and that perhaps it is good to bear that in mind. But I realize that I have taken too much time with various caveats about what the subject is or could be. Let me go straight into the Central European or Eastern and Central European issue with illiberal populism. I think it has three main features, and I need not dwell on them. There will be a panel after, we can discuss them more in detail. I will simply present them in a very telegraphic style. One is the democratic regression, or if you want, authoritarian drift. The second is the rise of ethnic nationalism as a prime source of political legitimation. And the third is the culture wars and basically the way the anti-liberal forces have been using new versions of old conservative arguments in that context. So briefly, and obviously when I'm making general statements, one should bear in mind there is a variety of populism in East Central Europe. In fact, I think one of the contribution I said to the volume edited by EVM was called Varieties of Populism, because obviously, you know, Orban and Kaczynski, yes, they are a kind of team, you know, let's make Budapest in Warsaw, but you know, Fico is another proposition, etc. So I will try to refer to that difference, but first, some of the main features of what we call the illiberal backlash or authoritarian drift, call it whatever you wish in this context. One is the challenge to the rule of law, familiar to all of you, constitutional courts, tribunals, independence of the tribunals, etc. You read the newspapers, it's, you know, look at just what's happening in Poland, and you see exactly what I have in mind. The second is the independence of the media, of course, namely public broadcasting. I mean, the first thing they did in Poland in the first 6 months, they sacked 260 journalists from public broadcasting. You know, that's for a start. Though that can be partly compensated by importance of private media in Poland, less so, almost none in Hungary. In fact, in Hungary, you practically don't have an independent newspaper. I didn't think I would see a Hungarian dissident friend of mine, a very dear friend, Laszlo Reich, who died last September, same age as me. So I'm very, you know, we're old friends, you know, almost 50 years friends. And last time I saw him in Budapest was about a year ago, and he was lamenting that the last independent papers that disappeared was Népszabadság. Now, for those of you who have, no, Népszabadság used to be the paper of the Communist Party. So, which meanwhile, of course, has undergone transformation and became a very, very decent sort of left of center, quite informed newspaper. But the fact that I would see a former dissident friend lamenting the disappearance of Népszabadság tells a great deal about that situation. And finally, the third element is the control of politicization of public administration. You have this convergence of both, with the argument that you have to dismantle what the liberal elites had established after 1989, which is a kind of condominium between former reform communists and some experts associated with the opposition in the previous period. And you have this network, układ in Polish, and you have to dismantle this network, and you do it through the steps that I have mentioned. The politicization of public administration. You know, political loyalty becomes more important than competence. And yeah, so this is clearly the main ingredients of what we are talking about. And indeed, in some cases, it verges on authoritarian. In the Hungarian case, I mean, some of our colleagues, you know, consider that. I mean, Larry Diamond says, you know, the death of democracy in Hungary. Tim Garton-Ash says Hungary has become a one-party state. Zsuzsa Szelényi says, you know, this is a new type of regime change, etc., etc. I mean, I could go through the list of, you know, people who consider that we have gone beyond the line that I was suggesting in this continuum. Yeah, this is serious, and you have a, let's say, a milder version of the illiberal populist phenomenon in elsewhere. Well, Grisha Mesezhnikov will tell us about Slovakia. He will mainly tell us how the elections will turn up, and that is important for Slovakia, but perhaps for the whole region. But I would say Slovakia was a good example of what we are talking about. We have forgotten about. You had hard authoritarian nationalist populism in the 90s. That was under Mečiar. We forgot about that. And we then had a softer version. What Fico provided is a soft landing for the, so to speak, the Mečiar constituency, the Mečiar phenomenon. And now he's himself being undermined. And perhaps, I mean, we will see how it turns out. But undermined, I wait to see by whom, because there are also other nationalist parties. I mean, Fico made his campaign. For those who don't know, his party is called Smier. Smier means direction. He didn't say which direction. So that's one of the definitions of populism. You know, you say direction, but you don't know which. Only at the following election did he indicate in brackets social democracy, because that's where he wanted to go. By the time he said he was a social democrat, he turned into a rabid xenophobic nationalist in the following campaign, where he said not a single Muslim would sell foot in Slovakia. Why? Well, they would be unhappy here because we don't have any mosques. Okay, so this is a soft version, but there are harder versions. There is the SNS, the Slovak National Party. There is Kotleba, which is, let's call it a fascist party. Neo-Nazi, okay. I was saying fascist. It was not, yeah, no-Nazis. Better. Okay, good. Okay, we have a, can you imagine combination of fascist and neo-Nazi? Pretty nasty stuff. Okay, so we have there a, they didn't go as far as in Poland and Hungary, but as we have seen through the revelations made in the last 2 years after the assassination of the journalist investigating corruption on a regional level, the interconnection between business, mafia, crime, and the judiciary and politics, etc., is, you know, gone very far. So there you have a problem. In the Czech case, you have three faces of populism: Babiš, Zeman, Okamura. Babiš, I would say, this is entrepreneurial populism. So he's anti-liberal. You know, Parliament, he says, it's a talk shop. We are doers. You know, all they do is talk. We are doers. He says the state should be run like a company. Well, he has a company. He knows. So this is it. And this is more closer to Berlusconi or Trump, businessman who enters politics. So this is this kind of phenomenon. But it hasn't gone as far as attacking the independence of the judiciary or constitutional court or media, etc. He has bought some media. Okay, this was it. This is a Berlusconi syndrome. You are a successful entrepreneur. You buy some media. Third, you go into politics. So that pattern is there. Has he dismantled separation of power? No, not that he wouldn't like to. I mean, right now he's under investigation from the judiciary. And the other two faces, you know, again, I don't have time, but Zeman, he self-described, you know, he wrote after the election of Donald Trump, his letter to Trump was, in my country, they call me the Czech Trump. So that sums it up. And he ran his election campaign with a slogan, stop Drahoš, which was his opponent, stop the migrants. So, yeah, there are no migrants in the country, but so that's the second version. And the third version is Tomio Okamura. The strongest defenders of the threatened Czech identity is called Tomio Okamura. And he's, of course, his party is a party of direct democracy and advocates, and this is one of the features, of course, of the illiberal populism. They ask for direct democracy, referenda on absolutely everything. How to account for this? And again, I can only mention the main features. One explanation has been given, is this socioeconomic reasons? This is the first hypothesis, you are familiar with it. This is the most widespread actually in the Western discussion of populism, that this is directly related to the 2008 financial crisis, its impact, and you have a long list of studies trying to substantiate that argument. There's a group of my colleagues at Sciences Po, you know, Ian Algan, etc., they just published a study which is mainly focused on that interpretation. So it is there. I think it's fitting in Western Europe. I have more difficulty with it in East Central Europe. Not that though you can connect it, you know, like winners and losers in the globalization. Though you have winners and losers of the transition, and indeed you can try to make an argument, and some have made it. I'm much more reserved about that, because when you look at the economic data, you don't have much substantiation for that there was no economic, say Poland, if we take that situation. It's the only country in Europe that didn't have a recession, and the GDP has grown per capita, you know, they have now overtaken countries such as Greece or Portugal. So I have difficulty buying the socioeconomic argument, though I do not dismiss it entirely, because there are huge regional disparities, and the prosperity of the cities is nothing to do with what's happening in rural areas or small towns. So, and of course the big divide with the east of the country, and it no longer fits the last election, but it used to, that the electoral map of Poland looked like the map of the partition of Poland. And I tried to, the 18th century partition, for those who were not sure which one, because there was a 1939 Hitler-Stalin partition. So I looked into that, whether there is economic evidence for that. And the wife of Alex Molar, who you know, she has done a study on that, and she says there is no substantial evidence to show that on one side or another of the historical border there is such huge difference. There are minor differences, but not enough to explain why you would have a vote. Peace vote would be much stronger there. No, she said it's a religious factor. Religion mattered much more in that part of Poland. That was where Polish identity and religion was most closely identified, and that is a better explanation in terms of historical legacy rather than the socioeconomic factor. So that's, yeah, in the Czech case, I mean, lowest unemployment in Europe, constant growth. I mean, you do not have an economy. I take it there are regions that are not doing well in northwestern Bohemia, etc., etc. I take that, but that is certainly not sufficient. So what are the explanations? Where should we be looking? And in trying to look, I started rereading things that some of our friends, and in fact, some of the things I myself have been writing at the time, but some of the things that others more enlightened have been writing. And I would give you two Polish examples. And basically they could go under the heading, you cannot say we have not been warned. And that's, one is from Geremek and the other one is from Michnik. Okay, this is Geremek, 1990. I have the text in French, I didn't have time to translate it, but I give you a very, very rough view of what it is. It says, there are three perils in this transitory period for the countries recently liberated from communist dictatorship. The first is populism. This is 1919. And he explains the historical background, why it is there. And the populism can become a dangerous weapon in the hand of demagogues, of politicians, or demagogue politicians. And they could overthrow a democratic order which remains weak. The second danger comes from the temptation to introduce a strong hand, authoritarian government, basically. He later uses the term strong hand. Well, it's basically the same thing. And this is a particularly strong temptation in post-communist societies. Okay, and he says because the democratic institutions, counterweights are weak, etc., etc. I switch to the third danger. The third danger in this period is nationalism. Under communist governments, the simplest form of resistance was a recourse to national feelings, which ensured solidarity among people, communal solidarity. And then he goes on about this feeling has undergone deformations and can become nationalism and chauvinism. 1990, he was onto something. I have similar quote from Adam Michnik. We were at a meeting in Krakow, February 1991. Adam delivered a long speech, which everybody was amazed of because we were in a triumphalist mood and he was pouring cold water. And he published it later in Kritika. So those of you who are interested, you can read it. But if I have to give you, well, do I have time? Probably not. Well, I will not give it. He basically says you also have. Adam also identifies three threats. They're close to Geremek. I will simply mention them. But he calls them three fundamentalist threats. And he says there is nationalist fundamentalism. That is to subordinate, he says, all spheres of social life to national defense of nation and national interest, as opposed to what he says, cosmopolitan, nihilistic, leftist tendencies, etc., etc. The second fundamental is a religious fundamentalism. And I remember in Krakow he was saying, oh, this would be the Iranian scenario. Okay, well, slightly overstated. And the third is populism. And he says that the language of rebellion against the communist system was them against us. And he says, well, that is understandable in that situation. You're dealing with a totalitarian regime. But that kind of thinking, them against us, is a political culture that can be used by others in different circumstances. So I think these two Polish friends of ours, one could add Kolakowski and his essay, I remember, Among Moving Ruins. And he says we should not think that after communism, there cannot be other forms of authoritarian rule that can come. That was immediately after. So you have at least 3 Polish warnings about the authoritarian threat. So that's the first, the hypothesis about socioeconomic, I find of limited relevance. The second hypothesis is more about nationalism and how you move from the defense of popular sovereignty, which is what the populists do. They don't like separation of power. They don't like to be constrained. This is what Kaczynski calls legal. We have to fight legal impossibilism. We have to break out of this straitjacket that the Constitution and various institutions impose on us. Okay, so there's but in the name of what? In the name of the sovereignty of the people. Okay, so this is why it's part of a democracy debate. This is, you cannot entirely dismiss that debate. But then you switch from popular sovereignty to national sovereignty. Again, the flip side of the coin. And there you defend the nation, but the nation defined organically. In the peace program, the nation is a real community connected by ties of language, by an entire broad semiotic system, culture, historical faith, and solidarity. The phrase semiotic system clearly refers to Roman Catholicism. So there you have a definition, popular sovereignty, national sovereignty, and defined. The nation defined, as I just said, and you have there the old defense of nation under threat. That is the main resort of the populist authoritarians. And where does it come from? Well, again, if you read the authors from the region, particularly István Bibó, he, in his famous study of the misery of the small nations of Eastern Europe, he had this sentence that democracy is under threat when the cause of liberty comes into conflict with the cause of the nation. And i.e. individual freedom versus collective freedom. And the problem of East Central Europe, this is why he calls it the misery of East Central Europe, is because there were nations without a state, that there was this emphasis on the communal ethno-linguistic concept of the nation, Kulturnation, and that, he says, you should, for democracy to survive, you should avoid these two being in conflict or being opposed. What the nationalist populists have succeeded in doing, Orban, Kaczynski, Fico, others, is to frame the migration crisis in those terms. In those terms, the nation is under threat, but the nation understood in those terms. The cause of the liberty of movement, threatens the liberty of the nation, the independence of the nation, its cultural identity, etc., etc. And that has been a historical legacy. Bibó was writing in 1944, but of course this was all reinforced by the communist period, because you have, under communism, you have consolidation of homogeneous nation states. With the war, extermination of the Jews, expulsion of the Germans. So suddenly you have Poland is a homogeneous state, the Czech Republic today is a homogeneous state, etc., etc. So you have homogenization of the states, and of course the Cold War makes sure that, okay, you cannot get out, but nobody can get in. So you didn't have the migration waves that you've had in Western Europe over the last half of century, and therefore the whole debates, West European debates about multiculturalism that are related to it. So there you have, I think, the second ingredient, the capacity of the political elite to frame the migration debate in those terms. I'm not saying the migration debate is a cause, it's a trigger in that process. And then the third element is the what comes under the heading of the culture wars, is actually not unrelated to the previous one, because if you reject West European multiculturalism, which is associated with liberalism, EU, freedom of movement, etc., you then have a whole range of other issues which can come under the heading of societal liberalism, and that ranges from, I don't know, from gender issues, gay marriage, all the way to multiculti. You have a whole range of what goes under the heading of and which has become the prime target of their attention. Richard Legutko, the Polish, I'm emphasizing Poles in this talk perhaps excessively, but he has written actually a book called The Totalitarian Temptation. You know, that was a book by Jean-François Revel, Totalitarian Temptation. He thought it was socialist statism was a threat to liberal democracy. No, for him the totalitarian temptation is the liberalism, which has substituted communism because it wants the same thing. It wants to destroy the family, it wants to destroy the church, and it wants to destroy the nation. And you have there the three ingredients that the new ideology tries to do. Now, what is, of course, I'll have to skip the rest of the argument, but I think you got the gist of it, is that you have there with the three ingredients, you have there things that are, some of it has very specific Central European features and roots, Geremek and Michnik were onto something in 1990. They were worried about not the communist legacy, but the pre-communist legacy, let's say the political culture of their society, and the culture that can be resistant to communism need not be a culture that is, let's say, favorable or to liberal democracy. So that was their concern, and that was a dog that didn't bark. You know, you could say after a few years, well, that didn't. They said that, but it didn't happen. Well, it's happening now, and that's why we are sometimes having to think in longer-term periods. I mean, the final explanation in this list would be related to authors that have been writing about not about East Central Europe, but Michael Walzer's book, which talks about India, Israel, Algeria. He takes three countries, and he says you've had modernizing elites, you know, building the state, and creating conditions for modernity, for development, separation of religion and the public sphere, etc., etc. And what you have after 25 years is a backlash. Everywhere they are being replaced, or they have been replaced by nationalist, conservative, authoritarian, etc., etc. So perhaps in East Central Europe, we've had something like a cycle like that, the liberal cycle post-89, that got exhausted. Got exhausted partly because it had succeeded, it had achieved its purpose. If the purpose was to install democratic institutions, well, you have them. Guess what? They are in crisis everywhere. You wanted to join Europe. That was a second goal. Well, you are welcome to Europe, but we are in crisis in Europe. And you wanted to have a market economy. Well, you are, and we have a global. So, mission accomplished. The liberal cycle has accomplished its mission, but it has exhausted its purpose. It was unable, the liberals have been unable to find a common project, a future-oriented collective project. And this is where space opened for the we'll call it illiberal populist or what have you. Final word, this is of course part of a broader European problem, And we are in a Europe of communicating vessels. You know, it's who is influencing. We thought, because of the enlargement of the EU pattern, that it was all spreading from west to east. Well, not necessarily. We now see new realignments in the EU, political realignments, and the key moment in those realignments, oh my God, the key moment in that realignment is what is happening in the EPP vis-à-vis Poland and Hungary, particularly vis-à-vis Hungary. This is the dilemma of the European right. Do you accept the Orban type of illiberal democracy within the European framework, within the EPP framework, and at what cost? And if not, what would be the consequences? What would be the political realignments, not just Orban, Kaczynski, Budapest in Warsaw, but on a European level? And you can reassure yourself by saying, oh, we are in Vienna, and we have seen that when the right aligns with extreme right, you can then switch and go to a different kind of alliance with the Green. And so you say, well, this was just a bad moment, and that's how, that's the best way to deal with it. You can also reassure yourself by saying that Salvini thought he was in charge, he was cut down to size and has to, so you can reassure yourself about that, but the trend is here, in the whole of Europe. And for those who are interested in the ideological dimension of that, look at the Rome conference that took place recently with Legutko that I've just mentioned, with Orban, etc., but also with some of the luminaries of the conservative nationalist right. What is it they call their conference? God, honor, country, etc., a national conservative conference. So what is interesting, that they are now claiming the conservative agenda, and I must end on that. The Orban's problem with Europe and with the European right in particular, because this is where crucially it happens, is that he had his illiberal democracy was something the right, the mainstream right, couldn't swallow, because they were part of liberal democracy. They built the European project as part of liberal democratic vision, separation of power, independence of media, etc. And he switched, interestingly, his discourse. He no longer brags about illiberal democracy. He talks about returning to conservative Christian democratic values. You have abandoned European values in the name of some centrist liberal project. You know, you have yes, you have a CDU in favor of gay marriage and what have you. So they've abandoned family values. They have abandoned the nation in front of Europe. And we are the true upholders of a certain idea of Europe. And so this is the pan-European strategy. And of course, you can either, this is a dilemma for European liberals, will they simply oppose to that and defend the liberal, multicultural, normative constitutionalism, etc., versus this identity politics combined with a vaguely defined Christian democratic defense of Europe? Or that may be another option, at least a question for liberals, is it wise to leave the nation and European civilization, the terms used by Orban, to the nationalists and the populists? You can have a definition of the nation which is not exclusionary, which could be based on a civic principle. You can have an argument about European civilization. Read Geremek, read Václav Havel. They talk about European civilization, not in the terms that Orban does, but in the sense that we consider ourselves the inheritors of something, and this is what has been lacking to the liberal argument. So long as you have liberal argument confined to market and legal norms, rule of law, versus populists addressing nation identity, Christian values, Europe, in a defensive mode against various threats, I think that you would be constantly on the defensive and possibly losing side. So that's at least the question posed to the nationalists and the illiberal populists confront the liberals with true questions about who they are and what they want to do with the European project. Sorry, I've been too long. This is what happens when...
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was just looking at the program thinking we have at least 20 minutes for a general discussion before we move to the first panel and then break up for lunch. So I think we should just take questions. We do need to pass the mic around, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I have several general thoughts and remarks, not very precise ones, but I mean not relating generally to what you said, but to some parts. Regarding Michnik in 1991 and his catalog of fundamentalisms, I think he missed one fundamentalism, which is market fundamentalism, which has turned out to be very problematic. It was questioned by anti-globalization movement since 1999. Nobody paid attention. It played a role. I'm not saying that it's the only factor, however, it played a role. It was very convenient for Michnik not to talk about it because he had his market niche and he functioned very well, so he didn't see the problem. I have several comments regarding this socioeconomic explanation or socioeconomic aspect. First of all, I think GDP is a very bad indicator when we talk about social phenomena, because GDP just tells you that economy has generated certain amount of money. This is like saying, you know, a company that's making profit, nobody can be unhappy in this company because of low wages, right? There's no talking about distribution, no question of fairness. I think this is a very important concept, that people find situation unfair. It's a large problem how people conceive and how people perceive fairness, but people do not think that economy is functioning in a fair way, right? Fairness is not an economic concept, it's a social, moral, ethical concept, so we would have to go into a completely different field. Another problem is that this GDP and a general, you know, GDP is going up, so it's okay. It assumes that capitalism is not problematic. So if capitalism functions well, everything is well. Again, a very large field, I don't want to go into this. I think even a well-functioning capitalism is problematic. If you do not have welfare state to soften the problems it creates, then you get into very nasty situations. Regarding Poland, there is a clear correlation between wealth and voting. It's not one-to-one. However, you can see, you look at cities or country in general, you can see, for instance, I live in Warsaw, in a popular poor neighborhood that votes 55% for law and justice. The wealthy neighborhood, the most rich neighborhood, they vote 55% for civic platform. So you have a direct, you know, opposition. Again, I don't think it's the only factor. However, if you develop it in class terms using Pierre Bourdieu, and you add to wealth or income, which is material capital, education, which represents cultural capital, and a place of residence, which represents social capital, so, and you create a class based on these three elements, then you have much closer explanation of what's going on. Then you can see that people with high education, people who live in big towns, so they have a high social capital, and with high income or wealth, they tend to be open and liberal and vote for freedom of movement, Europe, etc. People who are not educated, low cultural capital, who are poor, low material capital, and who live in the countryside, so they have low social capital, they are much more closed and they are much more populist, etc., etc. So I would say there is a class explanation, not necessarily economic explanation. I also think to finish, this communitarian element that you mentioned is very interesting, that they want some community, they want family, nation, religion. These are the only three communities that are left after neoliberalism destroyed class identity as a community and trade unions. This is, I think, very, very important element, right? And also, I believe that we have had this liberal erroneous belief in individualism as being ultimately the most attractive form of subjectivity for everyone, that everyone ultimately wants to be an independent individual. I think it's attractive for some people. I don't think it's universally attractive in society. I think people also want community. They want to belong to something. So they have just family, religion, and nation left. Other communities are destroyed. And the last thing, you talked about success of liberalism. For sure, construction of institutions, etc., etc. However, I think in the 1990s there was an ultimate promise of liberalism that has not been fulfilled, and that was universal recognition. That would be all equally recognized. We would enjoy, we would be proud of what we are, etc., etc. We have freedom of movement. Polish workers go to the UK and they find, slogans written on the wall: "Fuck off, Polish scum," and an incredible anti-Eastern racism in the UK, right? It's not. I don't think it's not a moral judgment. It's just a recognition of a certain fact that is there, right? So after 30 years, I don't think that people in the East feel that within European Union we have this universal, liberal, egalitarian recognition of everyone. So this I think is a reason that makes them at least skeptical or even hostile towards liberalism, and I think it's an important failure of liberalism. So I don't think everything has been so successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Just to comment on this xenophobia in the UK, which I experienced, it's not only against the Poles. It is basically, especially after Brexit, was a big rise in xenophobia against migrants, but not privileged migrants. So it's a very complex situation. Which migrants are feared, which ones are said to take the jobs away, etc., and others. So, but there's certainly a non-egalitarian tendency across the EU, which started already at the European Convention 2000, 2002 and 3, which we studied in detail with ethnography, and you could see that the delegates from the Eastern countries were treated differently than delegates of the Western countries. So that was obvious in dialogue, in day-to-day interactions. So it was obvious European second class. But I wanted to come back to Jacques' issue about the European People's Party and the big problem for the European Union. I see it in a very similar way as you do. If the if the EU doesn't sanction the Hungary and Poland and whoever else really goes against fundamental European constitutional rights, the Human Rights Charter, etc., then everybody will lose, or many people will lose trust into the European Union, especially now as an Austrian. I mean, I think Austria was the only country which was ever sanctioned by the EU in the year 2000, which backfired and was not a good idea in the way it was done. But basically, it never happened again. So you had Berlusconi, fine, now you have Orban, and now you have, but sort of the transgressions are much bigger. Yeah, so the transgression in Austria was there was this party suddenly in the government, but they didn't challenge democracy. They're challenging democracy now much more than they challenged democracy in the year 2000 here in Austria. Yeah? So there's a big difference. But now, if nothing happens and Orban and Kaczynski can just continue to do what they're doing, then the EU will be an economic federation, but that's it. Yeah. So all the value and the talk about identities and so forth, you can drop. Yeah. So I think this is a big challenge for the Commission right now, and it's a big challenge for the European People's Party. And I wanted to ask you if you think that sanctions with money would make sense, because I think that's the only way one could go. So if you don't show solidarity, then why should you get this money? So, but maybe that's wrong. And the second issue I just wanted to comment on is all these parties can only be successful if they are supported by the mainstream conservatives. There I agree completely with Jan Werner Müller and also Eric Vuillard in his wonderful book, L'Ordre du Jour. I think it's one of the best books written recently, where he shows how also the Nazis could only come to power because big business supported them. Yeah, and the same is true with Trump. If the Republicans would say something, Trump would fall. Yeah, but they all love this power, and they get a lot out of it, of course. And the same is true in all these countries. So if the conservatives would not shift so much to the right, these parties would not have their success, which they have. And the same was true in Austria. And basically, the conservatives have taken over the program they've swallowed the far right. It's not like Kurz suddenly became green. Yeah, turquoise became blue. So the government which we have now is actually very similar to turquoise blue with some green spots. Yeah. So it's an interesting way of, the shifting.
I have the following question, because when we go to populism, we normally go to the populist parties. But if the problem is kind of a rejections to liberal democracy, is it not much more interesting to go to try to see to what extent the liberal democracy in the way we have defined it was the product of a very specific period and which was based on specific preconditions which are not there anymore. For example, to what extent the fact that you have a major clash between two universalist ideologies in the time of the Cold War, one of them particularly vulnerable on the idea of the human rights, moved Western democracies to focus on human rights, on minority rights and others. And to what extent, basically, the end of the Cold War as a kind of a major precondition was going to lead to this type of a change of the democratic regime. So, because in a certain way, we're universalizing something that was very exceptional. And it was very exceptional because of the nature of the Cold War confrontation, which was highly ideological. Two basically ideologies that claim about the future, having both of them being very much rooted in the European Enlightenment. And I'm afraid that if we're just going to go and focus on the different populist actors, we're going to miss something which is much bigger. There is a major rejection of consensual politics. Go to the United States, it's not only Trump. Basically, there are major kind of a similar process going on the left with the Democratic Party. Obviously, there was a certain things about this consensual politics, which was based on the idea of kind of a war, which was keeping the cohesion of society, which is not there anymore. So it's not simply the rise of majoritarianism, but this is kind of a coming back to a much more traditional understanding of democratic politics, which was kind of a civil war with ballots. And this political polarization, which is a kind of a common trend and so on. So my major argument is to what extent we are basically not going into a trap to try to see all this as a kind of a deviation because we decided to constitute the Cold War type of a liberal democracy as a model. And for me, question is to what extent this model can endure in general, to what extent basically both economic but also geopolitical landscape is so different that we are going to have a kind of a change of the nature of the democratic regimes. And here I'm going to end up on something about which I do believe populists has a very, which is important for them. Democracy is about inclusion and exclusion. The right to exclude is a fundamental right for any democracy. It's excluding ideas. Basically, the fact that you're not allowing certain type of authoritarian ideas to be part of your system is a form of exclusion. Excluding people is a form of this. So in a certain way, the major problem in my view in the liberal discourse is that liberalism at the moment is talking about power only when you have a transgression, for example, corruption or genocide. But otherwise the message is power does not matter. It does not matter if you have it. And here is the story which I do believe basically this, and Germany is going to be, and I'm going to end up on this. In a certain way, I do believe this conversation is going to be even more interesting in 2 or 3 years, where you see basically the German political model, which was the major embodiment of this consensual politics, which is going this and that basically collapsing. And then it's going to be much more important to understand what are also kind of the pedagogical foundations of certain type of regimes.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great, and I wanted to say something about the point that you made towards the end. We talked about the religious dimension. We talked about the economic dimension and class dimensions, and sort of how we came to the present that we have found ourselves in. But I think you raised a very important point about the temporal dimension, which we used to talk in the 1990s much more, but we almost forgot. Because in the 1990s, when this sort of neoliberal transformation wasn't even called neoliberal transformation then, we had other different names for it, we were talking about sort of how we have moved in from the world of the 1950s, where working classes and middle classes could organize their future, could invest towards their future, could create a future, and the liberal project was actually promising them a future. A future that they could build for themselves and for their children. And then in the late 1980s and 1990s, sociologists were writing about sort of how this new socioeconomic transformation destroyed this ability to build a future. Because of these, sort of liberalization, then it was called, and now what we call neoliberalization. And yesterday also we were having a similar discussion, which we are all having similar discussions all around. But what you said was, I think, very, very important, that the liberal project not only sort of failed its promise of enabling the masses to build a future. Now, what you're saying is more different. Now it doesn't even offer a project of building a future, right? It cannot promise anything coherent, saying all of us, okay, this is what we can believe in together, and we can move towards. And not only that, what we're sort of surrounded with is, again, that triggers into this temporal if you will, curtailed environment, is sort of the climate threat. And this, that, the other. We're surrounded by these ideas that the future is not there anymore, right? It's almost sort of, the possibility is not there. So I think perhaps we should start thinking about, along with sort of the cultural dimensions and the religious dimension, the class, economic dimensions, also the temporal dimension of the triggers that sort of led to this situation.
I'm sorry, we just have to take a very quick word. We have to give you the word, and we have to check with Ivan as to what we can do regards time. I have 2 more. You can bring them into the general discussion after the break. I have 3 people on the list. Do you want to close with now, or do you want to take 3 quick?
Let's take 3 quick questions, and then Jacques, you can just give a quick response, and then we'll fold it into the... Yeah, I was going to say that it should be part already of the discussion.
So
Another remark to the question, but...
Yeah, but we can integrate it into the form.
Yeah.
Sure. So just it's kind of an addendum to Jan's point earlier. I was also very surprised when you said that there's not an economic factor in Poland and then cited GDP figures, because the stats I would tend to look at are things like share of GDP going to different demographics. And so I had a quick Google of that. And since 1990, the richest 1% in Poland have trebled their share of GDP from 5% to 15%. The richest 10% have doubled their share of GDP. And the middle 40% have seen their share of GDP drop by about half. So it's a significant change in the social structure and income structure of an economy over quite a short period of time. Or I'd look at house prices and asset prices, which, again, I had a quick Google of the stats, and they showed, quite significant asset price inflation in Poland up to, obviously with a dip through the recession years, but in the last few years. And so I suppose I'd be interested in your thoughts on how those factors have impacted on the popularity of the Law and Justice Party, and in particular whether we can, I think as we often can when we look to other countries, which I know perhaps better, understand the rise of authoritarianism as marching in step with the growth of the power of the richest people in a society, which seems consistently to be a factor in driving authoritarian societies.
Could you just pass the mic to the person behind you? Oh, you didn't have it. Okay. So I think that wraps it up. If I may use my privilege from the make 2 points very quickly. One, I think the gender issue needs to be thought about on both sides of the divide. Jan and I were having a very interesting conversation on this, on the studies in Poland, on the whole question of gender. And I think it needs to be looked at, I think, on both sides in the sense, I think what you have is a hyper-masculinity of all the leaders on the one hand, each one of them vying with the other to portray themselves as a hyper-masculine image. But the resistance to a lot of the populist or xenophobic populist movements is also coming particularly from women. If you look at India today, it's particularly Muslim women who are sitting, occupying the streets with the constitution in their hands saying, we will not allow you to do this to the country, no exclusion. This is, so I think the gender dimension on both sides. So there's toxic masculinity in this whole mix of xenophobic, nationalist, crony capitalism, and the gendered resistance on the other side. The other is a point which is a more general point. I think even, I don't think this is a fair description to say that our model of liberal democracies from the Cold War, maybe for this region, but for the rest of the world, there is no Cold War template of liberal democracy. Don't forget, all liberal democracies outside of Europe are after decolonization. So decolonization had very little to do with the dynamics of the Cold War in the way in which it played out. For the kinds of minority rights which were chosen were not because of the Cold War. India decided to protect Muslims because of the partition. It had nothing to do with the Cold War. You had all kinds of protection for ethnic minorities in Indonesia, in Egypt, all across the decolonized world. In Africa, linguistic minorities, which had nothing to do with the dynamics of the Cold War. It is to do with a strong faith, and then we can talk with Birai about why that hope faded. Because liberal democracies failed to deliver certain things. But don't forget, the democratic disenchantment you are seeing in Europe is very European. 70% of Indians are going to elections, and the poor are going much more to elections than the middle classes. So there is a huge enchantment with democracy because people believe that there is democratic change possible. So I think there is, I think we need to really think about the model of liberal democracy in a larger frame than just Eastern Europe. But this is my constant role in this house. So I'm playing true to form, but you will forgive me for this.
Well, my God, this is, I think most of what has been said belongs to the, already to the discussion of the next panel. I cannot possibly do justice to what has been said. I mean, just two or three remarks. One on what you just said, you know, the blind spot, market fundamentalism. And that has to be understood in the context of 1989 as the alliance, if you want, of political and economic liberalism. Political liberalism, the former dissidents, if you want, those who were the bearers of the political liberal project, got associated in the transition with economic liberals. You know, this was Václav Klaus in the Czech case. Václav Havel, political liberal, was suddenly associated with Václav Klaus, economic liberal. In Poland, they wrote in Balcerowicz, etc. So this alliance, which was used under the heading, we have to dismantle the power of the state, because the state was the enemy. That was a totalitarian state, and political and economic liberals had a common problem, so to speak, dismantling the state. But that was a temporary alliance, and eventually, to cut a long story short, you could argue, this is a more general argument, could be made, that political liberalism suffers today the consequences of that alliance. You know, that basically the global reach of economic liberalism has a victim, and that is political liberalism, which was its 1989 associate. So that 1989 moment is gone, so to speak, and we are now confronted with the consequences of that. Two things about that. We and you rightly say that, you know, GDP is an insufficient okay, it's a blunt tool. I grant you that, but still, if you take the just global increase of real incomes in most Central European countries over the last quarter of a century, it's unevenly redistributed, absolutely, you know. And the problem is, you are on a highway and you have two lanes. One is either stuck or moving very slowly, and the other one is moving quite fast. And although you may be moving, you do not know in this what is the acceptable measure of inequality in a society. And the assumptions made in 1990 that all this is acceptable because we are dismantling, you were legitimized by the collapse of the previous regime. That no longer works. And we are seeing some of the reactions to that. Who benefits? Well, the people I've been talking about. The Peace Party in Poland is a very good example. They are culturally on the right, and in terms of social policy, they're on the left. Why? Because the liberals, if you want, were culturally on the left, and they were economically on the right. They were the free marketeers, introduced the free market. They were fundamentalists in the sense, they were fundamentalists. There was this belief that markets. So this is it. You have the reversal of role, and suddenly Kaczynski makes his election with 50 zloty promise, family allowances, this allowance, etc. So they do the social policy, you know. So they are conservative and with a social conscience, so to speak, or with a social policy. So that is one of the reasons why they get re-elected. Of course, that's for sure. But I think that this is a final point on this socioeconomic. These are divided societies, deeply divided societies. I mean, Poland is, I've just been to Poland. I mean, the level of division, I mean, the people no longer talking to each other. There's a really clear division. Hungary, divided society. You know, look at the Czech presidential election. You know, it was a 1-2% difference, a divided society. And you find everywhere the same division that you mentioned. The big cities with people with higher incomes, higher level of education, etc., higher level of mobility, and who benefit from, let's say, the liberal Europe, and the others, the small town, rural areas, etc. So this division is something we have everywhere now. We have that in England in the Brexit vote. We have that in France. You know, there's a book by a French sociologist called La France périphérique, and it explains, I mean, it was written more than 12 years ago, but it explains the yellow vests, etc. La France périphérique, you know, you have thriving cities, but you have areas that have been neglected, etc. I could go on. You take American elections, and you have, sorry? And here in Austria, I'm forgetting the home. Absolutely. So this is a problem we have everywhere. Divided societies, and look at the political translation. You have the appeal by 4 mayors of the Visegrad group of the capitals: Budapest, Warsaw, Prague, Bratislava. And what do they say? You know, we want to pursue liberal, we are pro-European, we are against all the things that are being done. So this division in the society is also a political division. This is what makes me less categoric than some of my colleagues about, you know, this is already authoritarian regimes and there is no way back. I do not believe that. Maybe I'm excessively optimistic, but I believe that this is, there is there the potential, if you're looking at the counterweights to the trend I've been talking about, you have the domestic ingredients, and they are uneven in different societies. In Poland, probably civil society is stronger. The women's movement in Poland, very important. I mean, you've seen the demonstration against all the attempts to change the laws on abortion, etc., etc. So you have countries where you have a strong civil society opposition. And you know, it's the eternal debate about Poland. Is Poland an exception, or is it simply a magnified version of a regional trend? That's a discussion we used to have under communism. Well, somehow it returns in a different guise. So you have that internal opposition, and the appeal of the mayor of the city symbolically make it visible, and then you have the external counterweight, which is Europe. And that brings me to what Ruth Wodak was talking about, the broader European question, which is about mainstream right and extreme right. And one attitude, one temptation is, you know, if you can't beat them, join them, you know, try to make an alliance, etc., etc. And that has been tried, particularly in this country, but that temptation exists everywhere. I mean, there used to be, on the right, people like Maggie Thatcher or Strauss in Bavaria, who say they were so far on the right, they says, there's no room. So, you know, you cannot be more nationalist than Maggie Thatcher, you can, I mean, so, etc. So you occupy the field and you leave them no space. So that's one version. But that's before they grow. Now that they are a problem, do you go on their turf, which is a temptation of some, or as has been now, this is a debate within the EPP. This is why I think the debate is not about what kind of sanctions is EU going to impose. You know, is Article 7 going to be applied? Of course not. You need unanimity, etc. No. I was going to say the fate of the European project rests on the EPP. Well, that may be an overstatement, but what is happening in the EPP is absolutely crucial. And you know the two sides of the argument. There are those who are ready to do it, and who are they? The alliance that was formed when the Austrian case in 2000. What did you have then? Schüssel-Haider coalition. Who is the first supporter when Schüssel gets attacked and ostracized by Schröder, Chirac, and Brussels, etc.? Orban is the first supporter. The first press conference, he's not in the EU, but he understands tomorrow this is maybe my problem. So this is where the alliance. Who joins then? Stoiber, leader of CSU in Bavaria. They unite against EU interference, considered excessive, into domestic affairs, and the abrogation of Beneš decrees of 1945, which had confiscated the property of expelled Germans and Hungarians. This is why this is why Orban joins in. And you have this alliance that has been formed, and that has been the protective shield of Orban within the EU. When he joined, that was the protective shield. And that's why, after 2010, he used that to his best advantage. There always was the German right, CSU mainly, but not only. And that protective shield is no longer working. We have seen that in that vote, where for the first time the CDU and one CSU, Manfred Weber, but of course we know why. He wanted to become, he was a Spitzenkandidat, etc. So this alliance of Central European populists, not the losers of the transition, no, these are very prosperous. Laptop und Lederhosen. No, these are guys that are doing well but do not want to share with the riffraff. So that you have the new predicament now that the EPP itself is being divided. It has to decide. And for those who haven't seen it, I recommend the speech by Donald Tusk, who is the new ex-officio leader. He gave a speech which I don't have here, but it's, if you are undermining, you say you are a Christian Democrat, not illiberal Democrat. Christian Democrat is a new, new label. You say you are Christian. If you are undermining the rule of law, you are not a true Christian Democrat. If you are, victimizing or excluding minorities, you are not a Christian Democrat. If you are, and the whole speech is in that category. It's an open attack on Orban, who was his personal friend. They had personal close ties. So this is very important, that the European right is now divided on this issue, what to do about the extreme right, what to do, where to draw the line. And this is a crucial issue, I think, for Europe as a whole. I'm not minimizing that what Europe has done in terms of Article 7 or monitoring and intruding, and that may be very useful. But I think in terms of the politics of it, there you have, I think, the crucial moment, which, as usual, in such situation, people prefer to postpone the decision. So the decision about keeping or not Orban has been postponed. But that, why? Because the other option is, what are the other realignments that may emerge from an exclusion? Do you want to keep him, I was going to use a rude word, in the tent or outside the tent? Okay, you know what I mean. That's their argument now, and they fear the other realignments because Salvini is down but not out, and the problem that was raised more generally, not just about Eastern Europe, is there for Europe to stay. I've spoken for too long. I cannot do justice to all the other issues, although I would, let's keep it for the discussion, because I realize I have been delaying coffee and mainly the next panel.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and of course there was Ivan's. Well, I'll come back to it. Yeah, that was actually very important point, and I will come back to it in the next panel.
But we need to reshuffle our schedule a bit, maybe.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Jacques. That was a terrific kickoff and in-depth view, and also thank you for reminding us of our friends and colleagues who have pointed out the dangers lurking. We could add, of course, Ralph Dahrendorf from his book, etc. But I would like us to go straight into this panel. Feel free to get up, get your coffee, and there are various little Oriental delights, baklavas, but because we are in the thick of the discussion, I'd like to go straight away to our three presentations. I will refrain from giving any introductory comments, and I'd ask Anna Blaževa from Skopje, North Macedonia, to give us her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to shift.
No. That's authoritarian illiberalism.
Exactly.
No, I said feel free to get up and come back.
It's soft authoritarian.
Okay. I was participating in this project of analyzing the illiberal democracy developments first in my own country, in Macedonia, or North Macedonia. And then with this extension of our project, we tried to analyze the situation even broader. And my perspective is from, I don't know if I can say this, but it is kind of psychological perspective, because I'm interested in more of the affective dynamics of these political and social processes that were discussed previously. So I tried to analyze and understand the affective dynamics behind this crisis of liberal democracy, but also in this new race of right-wing populist authoritarian discourses and ideologies. I started first with the notion of crisis itself, because it is also used largely in psychology as a concept that tries to depict the situation in which the current capacities are not enough to face the challenge, the new challenge and the change that is occurring. So in political science, similarly, the concept of crisis is conceptualized through an event that has an unfortunate effects, but also points to this aspect of change that was for me important to begin with. So in terms of the crisis of liberal democracy, for me it was facing the fact that it is a project that, as we know, experience, and had perceived it, is no longer something that could give answers to what we are facing. So it is kind of a situation that could offer potentials for maybe both ideological, philosophical, and also political projects further on, and I'm looking forward to those. Something I can pick on maybe through these youth movements for environmental crisis, just another crisis to add up to this maybe which we are focusing on liberal democracy. So I would say that the crisis, I would not go into the context and the changes in the conditions, and I agree with Krastev's comment that the situation is, since the conditions and the developments have changed, and they ask for certain adaptations, but what makes it to be a crisis, it's also its dynamic, the dynamic of the changes that happens, the multiplicity and the complexity of levels and the change that of this change and the disruptions that it makes on levels both personal, relational, social, environmental, and in other sense, and also the intensity of all these changes, which, if we see it from this perspective, can also have an impact of trauma, because crisis that lasts for longer and has impact on such large systems can also be perceived as something traumatic. And this also leads me to another crisis which I try to follow, and it is mostly framed in terms of mental health crisis as well, which in its phenomenology can be related to the crisis process itself. The World Health Organization said that mental health issues and problems are now being the second risk to health after the circulatory and blood-related or coronary disease problems. And the problem looks even frightening if we take the figures coming out for the youth population having mental health issues and problems as well. A few days ago I come up to statistics that says that 60% of American youth already deals with some kind of mental health issues. And the most pervasive mental health problems people deal with are anxiety, panic attacks, depression, which are also kind of relating to this acute phase of crisis, also presenting this kind of manifestations and behavioral responses of overwhelming anxiety, despair, hopelessness, intense fear, confusion, disorientation, numbness, etc. And this point was for me important to understand that it is not just political, ideological, or social dimension to it, but it also has embodied or materialized itself in our relations and feeling in a sense of self. And that's why I think that, and now I'll come up to how I see this related to the right-wing or populist discourses. Politics of fear, all these experiences, affective experiences, have mostly background in the one basic affect or emotion, which is fear. And if we go and look around the politics of fear, which was also mentioned, it was always used as a political tool for manipulation of this affective experience in terms of setting the social boundaries, for perpetuating the hierarchies in social hierarchies as well. But if we take the psychoanalytic perspective to these notions and this phenomenology, we can say that all this exploitation of affects in politics were mainly unconscious, or dealing with the unconscious, and it is still used in the same manner today. What I was reading and analyzing about, for example, the very notion of anxiety and fear. It is, from psychoanalytic perspective, an struggle or a conflict between the internal ego and id forces. But if this conflict stays unconscious, it can provoke several or two major defense mechanisms known in psychoanalysis, which are projection and splitting. And I find the mechanism of splitting to be maybe the background of the populist discourses and ideology, since in its core, splitting as a psychological mechanisms means inability to integrate the positive and the negative experiences and notions of reality. And we know that one of the main strategies of populist movements is polarization, which draws exactly through these lines of a splitting of the good and the bad, of us and them, and in keeping this tension between between the exclusionary identities. So the second mechanism is the projection, which comes after the splitting, and the inability to integrate is then projected of the what is feared of, or projected onto what is perceived as a threat. And in the case of current right-wing populists, can be everything that under a name of a refugee, of migrant, of Muslim, or terrorist, or whatever else. So, and the problem of, or the dysfunction and destructive force of these mechanisms staying unconscious is that they are not going to answer the problems or the questions or the issues that people have, and that they support those ideologies, but they the problem is that the threat, which is the most important factor in initiating fear as a response, is somehow shifted or projected onto other object, which is not the source, the real source of the threat. So this shift will end the whole mechanism of and the whole ideology around this mechanism to a certain place that sticks the whole affective energy and the whole potential that it has into a destructive fields and bring a destruction into the society. For example, for me, it was pretty much a good example, the last shootings that occurred in Germany. As I have learned, this man already suffered mental illness, but his motives or his ideological motives were I would say based on these certain mechanisms that I was talking about. He so not just neurotic, but also even more problematic, or if I can say, schizoid and paranoid states could be provoked through these unconscious mechanisms of dealing with fear and affective states which are experienced through the period of crisis or in times of uncertainty. This was just my try to understand how this affective dynamic works. So sorry if I could not explain.
Nothing to be sorry about. Thank you very much, Anna, for bringing in that very important dimension of the affective. And we all realize, both from our personal experiences and experiences of friends and people we know, that much of this change that has happened over the course of people's lives, not only since '89, but even before, had various traumatic dimensions in living in an atomized society that communism was, and then being put into this pressure cooker of change, and then going through a variety of crises, not least the economic one. Ivan, your turn.
Thank you. I'll try to be very, very brief and to follow where Jacques started. Obviously, we see a global phenomena, and this global phenomena is about the transformation of the nature of the democratic regimes. The fact that the phenomena is global does not mean that the reasons are the same. And it does not also mean that constituencies that support these changes are the same. And from this point of view, I do believe Cellini was absolutely right when you see basically the pattern of voting in different places. So something is global. Obviously, what was global is first the emergence of a global market, which was not the case before. So now we talk about nation states, but we don't talk about national economies, particularly when we talk to smaller states. And one of the interesting phenomena that is now going very much to affect what we're seeing is that when we also see the problem of deglobalization, I know what deglobalization means for countries like the United States, India, China, even Russia. I don't know what deglobalization means for the small countries. How exactly Bulgaria is going to deglobalize. But this securitization of the trade relations and others are critically important, and they're going to affect the definition of state, the definition of democracy. Secondly, in my understanding, I'll go with this very kind of a basic definition of democracy that comes from Przeworski, and this is democracies are political regimes in which government lose elections. And I do believe this is quite important because part of the story that we have, for example, Hungary is a great example, is that you can have a certain conditions under which government cannot lose elections. If they have a total control over the information and media, if you basically have a total control over the judicial system, if it basically can use this for influencing results, this is the major story, because otherwise we go with too much a kind of a normative approach of what it is, and then we try to fit others, and we're totally disappointed. Just two statistics, which also come from Przeworski. Starting with 1787, which is kind of a ground zero for democratic elections, till 2008, on which they have a database, 477 times power changed hands as a result of the military coups, and only 444 times as a result of elections. Opposition is winning only in 1 in every 5 elections, historically. So in my view, it's also quite important to try to see that when we go and when we compare, we always try to compare basically with a very small period, and this is why I do believe that there is something very exceptional about particularly the last 30 years. And part of this exception was the extremely important role of the United States as also kind of a political power and normative power in the process of democratizations. When you talk about, for example, respect for minority rights and others in many places, this was the direct result of the American interference in these countries. This is not the case anymore. And Branko Milanovic is making, in my view, a very important point to say that what has happened is that capitalism has globally won, and we have something that we know from the fact when certain religions once. Now you have the kind of a fight of inter-religious divides, Protestant, Catholics, and so on, between different forms of capitalism. And this is quite important, in my view, in order to go to the specifics of the Central and East European case. Because obviously, part of the crisis of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe is crisis of the model. If you're trying to imitate the West, and this basically, you have a financial crisis in the United States and the European Union, even if in Poland you do not have a financial crisis, you start to be anxious because in a certain way, this is the model that you're trying to imitate. And this basically creates a general kind of a sense of crisis which was not there before. I'm also going to claim that we are slightly uncritical. This is interesting. All of us have been very critical to a certain way our democracies functioned before the populists came to power, but when they came, everybody goes in a position of a defense, and then you try, because many of the things that they're saying are half-truths, in order to defend the institutions, we also go on the half-truth story. The example which I'm going to come is from the United States. Basically, President Trump attacked the Supreme Court and saying that some judge was an Obama judge. And basically, the chief of the Supreme Court went and said, in our court, they're not Obama judges and Bush judges and so on. They're all these independent people who decided this and that. It's not true. For sure, there is a political bias when you're selecting the judges of the United States. This is why it's so important to have a president to control the Senate. So on one level, he's saying something which is not true. Not every decision of the Supreme Court is based on the political affiliation of the judges. So he's exaggerating. But in order to defend, we're exaggerating too. Poland is also an important example. There was a certain changes being done by the previous government that gave much more legitimacy to the attack on the constitutional tribunal that come from peace. Why I'm saying this? Because in a certain way, I do believe for me it's very important to understand that democracy cannot function under two conditions. If the stakes are too low, if when the government changes, too little is changing, then for the people there is no reason to vote. And by the way, this was one of the history of the Central and East European governments in the period of transition. You can change governments, but you're not changing policies. So the positive side of the consensus that is giving you continuation of policies is also giving this kind of an incentives for the voters to go radical in order to show their disappointment. And I do believe this was a necessary period because this was also part of the European accession. But then paradoxically, the very existence of the European Union is giving additional incentives for the people to vote for any type of a kind of a strange options, because also you said we're in the EU, we can vote for any idiot. He cannot do anything which is totally idiotic because he's going to be constrained from outside. And this logic is very strong. You're not afraid of your radical vote because Brussels exists. And the second story under which basically democracy cannot function if the stakes are too high. If basically if you're losing elections, you're losing everything, then basically it doesn't go. Because, and I do believe, unfortunately, we move from one type of problem to another. Basically, for a very long period of time, changing government did not change much, and now we are entering in certain countries in which change of the government is changing too much. Basic principles, kind of even the rules of civility and so on. So this is what I found critically important, and I do believe from this point of view, it's better to try to talk and to try to see populism not simply through analysis of certain actors, because, by the way, they're going to change their position all the time. Unlike of classical revolutionary parties of the 1990s, one of the interesting stories, particularly about right-wing populism, is that they do not have a kind of a classical project about the future. For example, fascists, but this was true for the communists, they have an idea of a different man and different society. The message of the populist to the people is, I like you in the way you are. Don't change. I don't want you to be better. It's up to you to decide how you want to be. And I do believe from this point of view, they can be very opportunistic and very much kind of a changing topics and positions. So if this is the case, and here I want to make just two last points. One is, it's much more interesting to see what kind of changes are going to affect the nature of the democratic regimes in the next 10, 20 years coming. And for Central and Eastern Europe, I'll start with the fact that you can never understand what is happening in the region if you don't basically keep in mind that incredibly ethnic homogeneity of the societies, which came as a result of particularly World War II and what happened there. You're never going to understand basically that this nativist discourse and so on if you basically don't understand that 90% of the population is coming from the certain ethnic groups and so on. This is critically important, and this is very different than the Western Europe, and I'm always giving the example between Hungary and Austria, countries that basically are very close to each other, have a lot of common history, but the percent of the Austrian citizens, I'm talking citizens, we're not talking about migrants, we're not talking about refugees, we're talking about citizens. The percent of the Austrian citizens who are not born in Austria is higher than the percent of the American citizens who are not born in the United States. We're talking about very diverse society. It's diverse on the level of ethnicity, it's not diverse on the level of race, it's not particularly diverse on the level of religion, because most of the people are coming from the neighboring country, but you have a very diverse society. And on the other side, basically, in Hungary, only 4.1% of the population, of the citizens, were not born in Hungary, and most of them are Hungarians from Romania or Serbia. So from this point of view, this is a major distinction, and I'm claiming that one of the first things that is going to affect very much the nature of democracy is that in the next 10 or 15 years, because of many reasons, mainly economically, Central and East European societies will become much more ethnically diverse. There are going to come people from outside. And by the way, this is very clear in the case of Poland, in which we basically have almost 2 million Ukrainians working there. And this is true even in the case of Hungary, where 70,000 people basically got the work permit just for the next year. Why I'm saying this? Because the interesting story which is going to happen in our country is something that we know from West Germany in the 1970s and 80s, which we have in Switzerland, is that most probably we're going to have a major divide between the participation in the labor market and political participation. You're going to have a people who are going to have economic and social rights, but they're not going to have political rights. I would be very skeptical that our countries are going to open the electoral body for these people. I don't believe we're going to give them a citizenship. And it is also, paradoxically, the existence of the European Union is going to decrease the demand of these people to get a citizenship. Because most of these people want to work in the European Union, and for many of them, our countries are transit countries. Are you really going to invest your kids to learn Bulgarian, basically to become part of the Bulgarian culture, going to the Bulgarian schools? Why now you're working in Bulgaria, but you usually can imagine being in Germany or Austria in the next generation. So how democracy is going to function in a situation in which, theoretically, it's quite possible that a huge percent of the people working are not voting, and a huge percent of people who are voting are not on a working age. So for me, this is a kind of a story that is going to affect very much the nature of the regime, the nature of the problems, and by the way, as a result of the nature of the countries. And as I said, this is going to happen much easier in the level of the European Union, and it also gives less incentives for the government to try to integrate, particularly when it comes to language, culture, and so on. It's different for countries like Germany or France, which are bigger countries, which basically have also different stories, but this is very much East European story. The second and the last point of mine, and this is interestingly enough, but the biggest problem is, and this comes also to the question that Ruth asks, why it's so difficult to basically try to expel Orban or anybody else. The problem is that you cannot do it while at the same time the Western countries are saying that they are not going to increase their money for the European Union. Because in a certain way then this allows all these governments to say, we told you, we are treated as second-class citizens. They want to lecture us, but at the same time they are not going basically to give any money. And as the Russian president recently said, European Union is going to disintegrate in 2028 when basically some of the major Central and European governments stop being the recipients of aid. And I'm saying this because the moment when you make money the major instrument of influence, be sure that this can have a backlash on many things. And I do believe that the problem of this punishment, and France is a great example, and I'm really very much kind of interesting to see what is going to happen to Germany, is that we see a kind of a strange movement. Listen, for a very long period of time, Germany made very clear, and from this CDU are very consistent, we are not dealing with the far right, we are not dealing with the far left. And then you end up in Thuringia. I read the last opinion polls. If the elections are today, basically the far left and far right are going to have 60% between two of them. So in a certain way, you cannot isolate majorities, let's put it like this. So from this point of view, obviously you should make a decision whom you want to integrate, either what kind of conditions and so on. And this is also, to be honest, for the CDU, it's not easy to go on the right, because the problem with the AfD in East Germany is that they're not on the right, they're on the east. No, this is not, I've been reading some data. The vote for AfD in Thuringia is an interesting vote. The conservative, the classical socially conservative and kind of nostalgic voters vote for the left party, because this was the old party, the old elite of the GDR. Here you have a people who have been kind of a much more in the opposition, totally disappointed with everything, but none of their, with the exception of the migration issue, but it's not a major issue because paradoxically you don't have so much refugees compared to other parts of Germany. We're talking about something different. You start to have the emergence of a regional type of protest parties. And I'm saying all this because all this major change of the political system, which is not simply that center-left and center-right obviously are not going to be what they were, is something that is going to affect it all this, and I'm going to end on this. So from this point of view, it's quite important in any type of analysis is to keep on one level the global level, because it is critically important. We cannot understand to a great extent the dynamics of the democratization after 1989 if we don't keep in mind both the emergence of a global market and the totally unlimited influence of the United States in certain parts of the world. At the same time, and this is changing, but at the same time, we should be very much clear what are the particular type of, be it social, economic, or be demographic of developments, which in my view are going to shape very much what is happening in these stories. And here comes the identity politics, which is an interesting story. Identity politics was always part of the democratic model, but it was kind of a preserved domain for the minorities. And now what you have is that basically a lot of majority groups, be it on racial or ethnic level, basically adopted policies which before were very much characteristics for minority groups. My favorite example, and I'm facing on this, is a group in the United States which is called White Lives Matter.
Ivan, thank you very much, and we go to Katerina Kolozova.
Thank you, Ivan. Okay, let me first give some context to the event and how come we organize, the two institutes organize this event under this title together. And then I'll move to my presentation as well, which will be a brief one, a sketch basically of a chapter I'm contributing to a book that we're co-editing with Niccolo Milanese, who is one of your fellows here. Jacques is also contributing to the book. So this is also an occasion to present this book project, as well as discuss the matter and kind of reopen the question of the legitimacy of the relevance and the level of of precision, let's say, of the notion of illiberal democracy, or is there, or to pose the question: is there such thing as illiberal democracy, and what are we facing when we are discussing this phenomenon, calling it different names, ranging from populism to extreme right-wing populism to simply the extreme right, or fascist or neo-Nazis, to left-wing populism, crisis of democracy, and so on and so forth. So it seems that there is this conceptual vagueness, there is lack of definitions, there is misunderstanding and sometimes, let's say, intellectual clash between the different positions in interpretation, even when the two parties are on the same side. We're criticizing the phenomenon, but we're deeply disagreeing on the definitions as to what constitutes the phenomenon. Is it a crisis of liberalism? Is it a crisis of democracy? What role does populism play in it? Does populism have any politically semantic value, or is it merely a structural vehicle of a certain change in the political paradigm? So I think that all of these disagreements are kind of shaping the debate. And basically, this is what the variety of chapters will look like, or these are the questions that they will tackle. We intend to publish this book with McGill Queen's University Press. So, also about the idea, where did this idea of a book stem from? Its origin is within a project that was a follow-up, I must thank them, of the OSIFE Foundation, which supported us. And they supported us, and when I say us, I mean the Institute, in the continuation of our research of the topic of illiberal democracy, or the forms of authoritarian governance or regimes mushrooming at that point in Eastern Europe in particular, and Macedonia, of course. So it was kind of an invitation to continue the discussion and to establish a bridge between what we analyzed in the Macedonian context. Also, we did contribute to the analysis of the Hungarian concept as well. I will explain how. And to somehow establish a bridge with the Western debate of the matter. Within 2 or 3 years, the situation politically changed so much in the West, so not just in Europe, but in the United States, in the West. This is why I'm generalizing. To the extent that we see similar phenomena like Brexit or America under Trump, very similar phenomena, and it becomes clear that it's not only relevant to bridge the discussion and see whether we from the east of Europe can contribute something to the table of the Western political discussion, but also the question that we posed in parallel, let's say, in the two intellectual scenes, kind of coincided. They met at a certain point. They became questions that or puzzles that we share, and whose solution we met without us being forced to present them and explicate them, etc. Let me illustrate what I mean by this. Last year, we had a panel in Berlin on illiberal democracy, and we had two speakers, Anton Shekhovtsov, 3 speakers, including myself, I'm excluding myself, and Tanya Bortzel from Freie University. And the discussion at that point was whether this notion of illiberalism was pertinent at all. We started off with debating whether it made sense at all. At the end, we agreed that it kind of does, and in what sense. But then, just a year ago, this question was kind of a new question. For example, there was some kind of a spontaneous mutual misunderstanding that we all shared. Like, I don't know, Anton came to speak about the right wing, I came to speak about populism, and Tanya came to speak about the crisis of democracy, but it turned out in the end that we were all puzzled by this concept. So the concept of illiberal democracy, the way I have elaborated it, I will just present it and then we can open it for discussion. In my chapter for this book is the following. I propose that there is a conceptual triangulation of populism, liberalism or crisis of liberalism and democracy. Populism can be interpreted very much in the vein of Laclau and Mouffe, let's say, as a discursive strategy, a discursive phenomenon, something which can operate almost exclusively on the basis of kind of a post-structuralist understanding of discourse analysis and discourse political economy. So we can look at it separately and in that fashion, and then analyze how it can be geared up into different ideological directions. To me, illiberalism becomes ever more pertinent as a notion. When we started the project, it was called, for example, by some of the people at the foundation, a misnomer, a simply wrong term that Orban chose for his style of governance. To me, it becomes increasingly relevant and convincing, a very precise definition. It is a paradoxical definition, that's why it's puzzling. Because the ideological content of illiberalism is negative. It's void of content. They come up with values as they go along, like, I don't know, traditional values or corporative managerial style of governance or law and order or whatever. There is no consistency, semantic consistency in the values that they fill it with. So to me, it remains a simply negative ideology of being against liberalism, and that's it. So, and being against liberalism and liberal values is something that can be enabled solely through democratic means, I would say. Otherwise, we would have other types of authoritarianisms. We would have monarchies or whatever. If we're talking about illiberal democracy, or if we're talking about populism, we wouldn't have populism without democracy. We need democracy in order to legitimize this absolute rule through the popular vote, through the popular support, through being the voice of the people. That goes to the extent, I will close now my intervention, that goes to the extent of putting into question the very constitution of illiberal democracy and the division of powers that you were talking about. suddenly the division between juridical power, legislative power, and executive power does not make sense anymore. The executive branch becomes excessively powerful and the embodiment of the people. Hence, the leader of the people, who is always a man, and there is this hyper... yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's the whole thing. It's never consistent. So the only consistent thing is this negative definition. Yeah, that can change in France. That's true. So to sum up, so this is put in question. The excess of the executive branch is the problem, and it's legitimized basically through this power of the political party that represents the people, in spite of the paradox that there is a deep division and polarization that Anna talked about, even though they claim to speak with the voice of the people as a whole, as a unity without any split within it whatsoever, which is obviously false, but somehow works. I'll close now. I'll just close with a methodological remark. The way I have approached this question is very much coincides with the way the Institute has analyzed the phenomenon. The Institute I work at is primarily applied social science. So we kind of worked from bottom up, beginning with, as Saussure would put it, from the concrete going to the abstract, beginning with the analysis of the very basic policies, and then see how it builds up into a greater narrative. This is how we analyzed Gruevski's regime in Macedonia, which was then, not us as an institute, but me personally I was asked to review one of the analysis commissioned by one of the institutes in Budapest of Orban's regime. The point is that it's been used also in relevant discussions of what's going on in Hungary and Orban's method of governance. And it seems that it worked, so that would be the proof that the methods of governance were very similar. So I would close here because I will go on if I don't stop now.
Okay, Katerina, thank you very much, and thank you for giving the background to this workshop conference that we're having here. That's a joint effort, and authors will be present in the book from the various institutions. As a point of order, a few of us will have to leave in about 5 minutes. Shalini, Ivan, and myself, because we have a meeting of the team, executive team of the institute. But I will pass the microphone as I leave to Katerina or maybe to someone else to finish off the discussion here, and then Dino will take you off to lunch. And we will reassemble at 4, and we'll have ample time then both for the second panel and for the discussion. So let me ask if there are any concrete questions people want to address, especially to Ivan, because he will have to get up. And
question to Ivan.
Absolutely. You have a microphone also.
Yes, because after that we are doing housekeeping, the two Ivans and myself. So this is our only chance to have an intellectual conversation. I'm sorry. So Ivan, I think the point you're making about the disassociation of economic and political rights, I think, is an important one. But the thing is, I think the dynamics are interesting. Well, one very small footnote. Everyone's got so upset and excited about Thuringia, but the population of Thuringia is almost the same as the population of Hamburg. So actually, we could be equally excited about the Hamburg elections because they show a very different trend. So I just think that I think there is something to be said for the media attention and the way in which things are getting, hyperly sort of. It's a German story. I get very agitated, but I get very agitated for a very simple reason. I have lived in Germany since 27 years, and I have all economic and social rights, and will never have political rights. As they told me very clearly, you don't have a job in Germany anymore, and you don't have a German husband. Those are the only two ways to get political rights in Germany. So paying taxes in Germany and living there for 27 years does not give me political rights. So there is something really problematic about the nature of the disassociation between economic and political rights, or economic and social rights on the one hand. So I have economic and social rights in Switzerland. I have no political rights in Switzerland. Why? I made the mistake of changing a canton. I went from Zurich to Geneva, so I lost all the possibilities of naturalizing myself because you need 10 years in a canton. So all I'm saying is there is a major problem, I think, which is not just mine. I think, so it affects, and I think Brexit would have turned out very differently if the British who were living on the continent would have been allowed to vote. The results would have been completely different. So I think there is a huge problem across Europe of a lot of people who are resident, working, taxpayers, not only like myself, who are outside of the EU, but people from within the EU who have been deprived of their political rights. And this is going to be increasing the case on the one hand, and then you have the Orbanesque moves on the other hand of trying to give political rights to Hungarian minorities in the neighboring countries, of trying to. So it's in a sense, I think, the whole question of not just who belongs, but who is allowed to vote and on what basis. And if that basis is no longer your contribution, which is an economic and social one, because they'll allow you to have the social rights, they cannot deprive me of those. But if I'm permanently left out of politically having a stake, along with the totally hypocritical request to me constantly to integrate, and I say, what the hell should I integrate into? You don't allow me to integrate. You don't give me a vote, right? So I just want to end on my interesting anecdote. I go to Switzerland, I arrive in Zurich, and the people who are seeing me on the streets, they are coming up to me and saying, so are you from Sri Lanka? And I say, no. And they say, never mind, we like the Sri Lankans very much. And, and I'm wondering to myself, what have I done? You know, one time I could have been a Sri Lankan and a good migrant, but of course I was not. And why do they like the Sri Lankans? We hate the Yugos. Why? The Yugos want to marry our women. The Sri Lankans marry among themselves, right? So much about integration. So no political integration, don't touch our women. This is something about masculinity and gender, which this story tells you. So no social integration on those lines, but we'll give you temporary or other working rights. So I think there is a very complicated story across Europe to be told, Eastern, Western. So what you're pointing to is a Eastern European pattern, but which mimics an old Western European pattern, which will have all kinds of, and here it's not the question of people not wanting to learn German because they're on their way to the US, you know, this is not the same story. But it is, I think, and it's a very odd kind of situation, sorry, this is too long, but the odd situation is the CDU does not want in Germany to integrate the likes of me because we are the wrong ethnic base. So you do not want us naturalized because we just look different, we couldn't be Germans. But the SPD has been very much against a certain kind of naturalization, also because they have been arguing this will stratify the working class on ethnic terms. We want to keep a market which is closed for wages, in which you do not have the US kind of ethnic differentiation of wages. So you have a very interesting tacit pact between the socialists and the conservatives, both against political integration of migrants.
Thank you very much. I do believe it's critically important. I just got on Eastern Europe. First, on what is the difference between Thuringia and Hamburg? The effect of Thuringia is the AKK effect. It's not what happened in Thuringia. This is the signal that it sent to the CDU. So from this point of view, Thuringia matters. Nevertheless, how many people live there. Secondly, you're absolutely right. And in a certain way, you have, okay, let's first take a place in a certain way. Well, let's be Bulgaria. What you're going to have? You're going to have, imagine in 20 years, 20% of the labor market, people from different places working there. And then 20% of your voters are going to live outside of the country, and they're not going to basically pay taxes in the country. And then you're going to have majority of the people voting being on a retirement age. So my story is that the nature, what is going to be decided in politics is going to change dramatically. So the change towards the identity politics is going to be very much the result of this. Because if you have a major decoupling between the economic and political, so from this point of view, the idea of the interest in a classical sense are much more redefined. And here comes the other option. The other option is also not without problems. If you decide to integrate and to give a citizenship, then the political parties are going to be very much tempted to integrate first those who are going to vote for them. And we know this very much from the United States, and part of the basic problem that you have in the United States is the Republican Party has a totally different view on migration, particularly from Central America. In the beginning of the term, during the Bush mandate, by the way, Bush get around 42% of the vote of the Latinos, for the following logic. They said people who are coming from Central America, they're mostly Catholic, they're anti-abortion. Most of them end up in the Republican states, so they're socialized in the Republican politics, so they can be part of the new Republican majority. Now, when the migration became a major issue, they see it much more as a kind of a pro-democratic voters. But my major argument is exactly this. Because of the major demographic change that is going to happen in the European society as a result of aging, depopulation, and everything that we know, it's not simply that democracies are going to change. What is going to change is what is going to be decided within a democracy. Because if such a big part of the labor market is not part of the political process, obviously you should decide what you are not deciding there. And if you basically don't want to integrate people learning languages, schools, and so on. So from my point of view, you can have a different strategies, and probably in different countries it could be decided differently. But this is a new thing, and I do believe this is going to be critically important. So on this point, I very much agree with you. It's not going to be like this. It's going to be also, particularly when we talk about the big ethnic groups, whom you decide to integrate. For example, if I know what is the profile of the Ukrainians, if they're going to be given citizenship in Poland, and if I'm in power, I can decide to integrate this. And this is not new. Basically integrating first those who are going to be your voters. And I'm going to end up on this because this is something that I'm recently interested very much, but Brecht has this famous quote after 1953, when he said, if the government is so disappointed with the people, they should deserve the people and elect a new one. I do believe in a certain way this is what the governments are going to be in a position to do.
Thank you all, and with apologies from the three of us that have to leave, please continue and have a nice lunch, and we'll meet all together back here in the afternoon.
Should we continue?
lunch?
They are going out.
So they can continue, right?
They can
we need
continue,
to go
yes.
down and have lunch. Otherwise,
So is this over, or are we taking any questions? Isidora, sit down. We have 10 more minutes for questions and discussion. Sorry, to Shalini or Jacques? Yeah, take the mic from...
Yeah, so I would like to refer to two things that were said during this panel. The first one as sort of a continuation of this Thuringia thing. I think it's really pertinent that we have a parallel search of right and left wing. And I think this is something that we have missed in the discussion so far, that we cannot look at the populist uprising just as populist right-wing uprising. It's rather voters flowing out of the center. Center is falling apart, right? So it's either right-wing or left-wing. Slovakia and Austria, the countries we discussed, they have center-left or left-leaning presidents, right? Having populist governments. So I don't think it's just a right-wing tilt. I think it's turning away from the center. The center doesn't hold, right? That's the thing. And I think it has got a lot to do with the problem that you raised, domination of the executive branch and the general crisis of the representation, political representation. And I think we should look at populism as a symptom, right? In psychoanalytical sense, symptom as truth that breaks through a lie. Right? This is why Zizek says, enjoy your symptom, right? It may be disturbing, however, it communicates something. And I believe what it communicates is that the representative institutions, liberal representative institutions, become dysfunctional in contemporary societies. We have to remember that these institutions were devised in the 18th century. We have an 18th century political institution in 21st century society, right? When you look at how people lived in 18th century, what were social relations, economy, society, politics, it was so different from today, yet the form that we are using was invented in the United States in 18th century, right? The US Congress is the longest serving modern parliamentary institution in the world. I think when we ask about what is democracy, there is another definition, not this, government losing. It's a constant questioning of the division between the rulers and the ruled. And I believe the problem with liberal institutions is that they were functional at a certain moment. It was a big progressive role of liberal institutions precisely in questioning this division of the rulers and the ruled. Well, nowadays, liberal representation has become a vehicle of rather reinforcing this division and not overcoming it, right? Lobbying, private financing of political parties, all this revolving doors between politics and enterprises, all this has become a sort of a political economic ruling class, and this institution rather reinforced this division than helped to overcome it. So I think it's rightful and it's quite legitimate that a democratic impulse now goes against liberal institutions, not in their favor, as it was the case when liberalism was confronted with feudalism. So now there is a term, the last thing, a sort of a competitive term to describe a regime we are living in. It's constitutional oligarchy. And I believe this is precisely the problem, that this liberalism has turned into constitutional oligarchies. So this is why it's being questioned from the left and from the right also.
I have some remarks. So I think that the title of this discussion is really very good, between totalitarian response and progressive dreams, but I think that something is really in between. And sustainability, or maybe survival of democracy, is dependent on the third force, the mainstream moderate political parties. Of course, they are not totalitarianists, but progressive section is in Central Europe quite weak. So it means that how democracy will work in the upcoming decade, at least, I think it will depend on how the mainstream, I would say, liberal democratic forces, not all of them are liberals. In Slovakia, for example, liberals is a really very tiny faction, how they will respond. And if we look to this, to the map, to these puzzles, which were brilliantly described by Jacques in his observations, we see that there is similarity in structural factors of, let's say, the populist surge in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Central Europe. But, and we see that really it's not lack of populists in both parts of the Europe, but what really Central Europe lacks enough the prominent persons who are identified with the liberal democracy. So we see here competition between populists. In Slovakia is a good example. Mečiar, Fico, they succeeded to consolidate the electoral support and then to concentrate power. I can mention also politicians from another countries, but speaking about the really prominent figures committed to liberal democracy and promoting values of liberal democracy, very few, or maybe even, I mean, I don't want to say that none, but what is the reason? I think that it's because, paradoxically, because of fragmentation of political scene, of party system. From one side, it was very important that after the collapse of communism, the proportional system was introduced, and at least in the case of Slovakia, maybe in some other countries, it prevented authoritarian forces from the concentration of power. But at the same time, it caused the fragmentation of the liberal democratic camp. So simply in Slovakia, maybe only one example of really crucial person who succeeded to contribute to renewal of democracy and market reforms. It was Mikuláš Dzurinda. All others, they are, I don't want to say that they are insignificant, but somehow they didn't have and still do not have support from the population. Exclusion from this is are two Slovak presidents, Kiska and Čaputová, because they succeeded to accumulate supports from all spectrum of liberal democratic forces, liberals, libertarians, civic conservatives, civic democrats, and so on. But now how to provide conditions for the executive power, how to provide conditions for mainstream executive power which will outnumber the populists. Few words about situation in Slovakia. Jacques referred to me. Now is something very exceptional happening in this country, because first time the authoritarian leader will be defeated by the conglomerate of mainstream moderate parties, but not only by conglomerate, but one particular party. So Mr. Fico, because it's still his party, is going, I think, to lose to Igor Matović. So the party of Igor Matović, which is really the less predictable politician ever, which we had in our country and still have. Igor Matović is the leader of the formation, which is not party, formally it's movement, but it's even not the movement, it's just the political project which is bringing interested persons to the parliament. Half of them during the electoral cycle left this party 2 times, and now he is going to be prime minister. So nobody have idea, how it will work with this kind of politician. He is a non-authoritarian populist. He is extremely efficient in addressing the people who are waiting for some changes. He's doing very good work that he is addressing some of potential voters of really extremist party, but at the same time, I mean, his party as a main force of the next ruling coalition, which will be formed by predominantly, and he is himself conservative, by moderate conservative forces, parties, movements, or projects. And quite interesting observation also in Slovakia that, I mean, during these 30 years of transition, populists, either authoritarian or softer populists, including Mečiar, including Slovak National Party, including Fico himself, 17.5 years, the country was ruled by these populists. And only 12 years and a half, they were ruled by moderate, pro-European, pro-reform parties. So it means that Slovakia is a good example how populists can coexist with the liberal democracy. Of course, they worsened the quality of democracy, but the new situation is after the last parliamentary elections, when really the totalitarian force de facto, which is this Kotleba's party, they are, as I said, really a combination of fascism and neo-Nazi, but they have Holocaust deniers and approvers on their candidate list. And so, of course, we will see what will happen. But it's very important, and just I'm connecting with this title of the debate, how liberal democratic forces, which are not even speaking about their adherence to liberal democracy, the word liberalism was somehow compromised in Slovakia. Just one example, our Speaker of Parliament, who is finishing, his leader of Slovak National Party, he's not so rude as Jan Slota, who was his predecessor, but just yesterday or day before yesterday, he called to the population to prevent the victory of liberal democracy. So not liberals, liberal democracy. So the guy doesn't know in which country he lives, but according to him now, the victory of liberal democracy, it means that the conglomerate of mostly conservative, moderate, but nevertheless conservative, definitely not progressive forces, they are going to win. So you see how society in Slovakia maybe is less divided but rather fragmented, and now in the governance it will be really problem to overcome this fragmentation.
Thanks, Grigory. Okay, Adam, you were next.
Sure. I think I'm going to change my question. I was going to kind of agree with what Jan said and add a couple of things to it. But I'd actually like to ask about Olano, who you were just talking about in Slovakia, because I'm not at all an expert in Slovakia, but just spent a couple of days there interviewing people. And I suppose my real concern is that it looks to me like Olano is a sort of another example of essentially a oligarch-controlled, very wealthy right-wing populist party. And if it wasn't for the fact that there are neo-Nazis to the right of them, we'd all be saying this is actually quite a scary phenomenon to see, essentially oligarchs, charismatic individuals who have huge amounts of money take control of politics in yet another European country. And I do wonder, I'd love your thoughts on whether we should be really quite concerned about that, the rise of Matovic and so on, and and be challenging that more than perhaps we have been.
Well, just explanation what is happening and why it's happening in Slovakia. Since 2006, no any other party had really chance to beat Smer. Yeah, it happened in 2010 that 4 parties together, they outnumbered the Smer party, but none any other party was capable to reach this, this goal. And something happened during the last maybe 3-4 weeks when in opinion polls Olano started to grow. I think that mostly it was because of the case of one guy who was on the candidate list, Jaroslav Nať, who is, by the way, very good guy, really. It's a good example how good people are drafted by Matovic. I don't know what will happen with Jaro Nať. And Jaro Nať was absolutely unfairly accused by law enforcement organ. Of course, immediately it was 3 days later cancelled, that he allegedly violated the law. It's in specific situation related to security. And then the feeling of, and all opposition supported Jaro Nať, so and he was the nominee of Matovic, and because of this Jaro Naď's case, this formation, this project started to grow. So since 8% to 13%. So it was closer to Smer. Smer had 18, maybe 18, 17, and then some other in some other occasions helped Matovic to rise to 60.9%, which was really 5%, 60.5%. And it was very close to Smer. So, and many people, I know personally some of them, they're very liberal. They are, for them, Matovic was unacceptable before, but now they have this feeling that finally somebody will beat Smer. Yeah, and now they are joining. It's a snowball effect. So the risky factor is that Matovic is now taking voters from other parties, and at least 2 parties which are oscillating around 5-6%, they're now in a very risky zone, because they will need higher support, and Matovic is now de facto, he's not ruining them, but he is taking the votes from these parties. Now, Olano is really a project without traditional patterns of party politics. Definitely, Matovic is not oligarch, and the party is not in hands of oligarch, but he is the main decision-making person in the party. Till last week, there were no information about about structure of this party, how it works, who is deciding. Of course, everybody knew that Matovic was deciding, but how the internal mechanism worked, it was absolutely unknown and unclear. And under the pressure from the media after Milan Šimička, the prominent essayist, wrote the article that Matović is going to win, but we don't know how his formation is functioning. And then they announced who are the vice chairman of the party. So it means that it was like really unclear. So everybody knows who is Matović and what is his approach to different cases. He is very anti-corrupt, person with very strong anti-corruption rhetoric. He is criticizing government. He is labeling Smer party as a gang of thieves and criminals. But so far, it's quite a paradoxical situation. He is 10 years on political scene, but nobody asked him, how your party, how your formation works. Yeah, now it's more clear, but still, as I said, he is the less predictable person in the whole post-communist history of Slovakia. Yeah, and he was labeled as a clown before. He was labeled as I said, unpredictable, and it definitely this was not the worst characteristic of him, because some people are even speaking that he is psychopath, which is I don't think it's true, but he is intuitive politician who is really able to employ, situationally, any tactics, any methods who would bring him additional votes.
So we have to wrap up this session if there are no further questions or comments, unless they're really short. Okay. Do you have something to add to the discussion, Jacques, before we close? Yeah.
I want you to something Ivan had said. Let's keep it for.
Let's do it as a conclusion to this session. Would you like to give those remarks now as a conclusion to the session, or leave them for the afternoon?
Well, I think the two would be better to
if they're here.
To leave it to the afternoon. Or perhaps simply a word about the Slovak situation, because that we may not be able to return to, because I think you are leaving. I think that this is, when people discuss, are they moving towards illiberal regimes or nationalist, populist, and how reversible is the situation? Slovakia shows, it's been through the Mečiar system in the 90s. People forget now. It was called the black hole of Central Europe, and Mečiar was considered, Václav Havel used to call him, the Slovak Milosevic. And he says the danger, I remember the discussion with Havel, he said, the danger is that all our political landscape will be people with micro Milosevic. We will have little imitations of Milosevic type of people who say, there are problems, I will fix it, strong leader, the nation must cling together, etc.
Small technical remark. Today, Mečiar is supported not so Mečiar, de facto,
okay.
He's participating in events organized by
Okay, but what I'm trying to say is what you've described is actually very interesting, because you have 2 decades. You have a decade of Mečiar and you have a decade under Fico, or more or less. Each time there is a possibility of undoing. So this is you may consider these to be undermining democracy, etc. But the only way to beat them is actually through the democratic process. And this is what's happening. The election in the presidential election, first of Kiska and then of Čaputová, shows that you can, in special circumstances, admittedly, after what happened in Slovakia, after the assassination of the journalists and the whole mobilization, you have then, an alternative can emerge, and the alternative comes from within. It's not because somebody in the European Union said, you will have Article so and so. No, this is change. Change will have to come from within. It can be encouraged from outside. It can be helpful. The change must be coming from within. The lot has been said about civil society as a key to regenerate, to create. that Slovakia shows that that can be the case, a connection between civil society, mobilization, emergence of new leaders. We must not forget that we also have a civil society that can be very hostile to liberal democracy. You know, we assume that the civil society leads to, no. We know independent organization in civil society that are a menace for liberal democracy. In Poland, you know, the extreme right-wing nationalists, etc. All sorts of associations, some of them linked to the Polish church in Slovakia, you may find different. So that I would question this assumption, the civil society, you know, will help Chaputova to become who she is. We should beware of thinking civil society leads you automatically to liberal democracy. I would have things to say about the main Slovak export, which is to the Czech Republic, and that's Mr. Babiš, who is of course a Slovak and who is the Czech Prime Minister, and there would be an interesting comparison to be made, but I don't think we have time for that, and that may also spoil your appetite. So let's leave it for the afternoon.